I was warned not to ever talk about this. Not in writing. Not on camera. Not even to my family. And for nearly 3 decades, I listened. But when a video you helped create resurfaces online at exactly 12:03 a.m., a video that was never supposed to exist, silence stops being protection and starts becoming guilt. So if this disappears, if my account vanishes, or if someone tells you I retracted this story, you'll know why. My name is Dr. Alan Mercer. I'm 72 years old now. I spent most of my career as a forensic pathologist contracted to federal research facilities most people don't know exist. And in 1996, I participated in an autopsy that was officially classified as routine wildlife pathology. It wasn't routine. And it wasn't wildlife. The footage that leaked last month, the grainy, partially corrupted video people keep arguing about in comment sections, that footage didn't show everything. It didn't show what happened before the camera was turned on. And it didn't show what the creature did after we stopped recording. That omission is not an accident. The man who leaked it understood something I didn't at the time. He believed exposure would save lives. I now believe exposure is exactly what almost ended them. I want to be very clear about something before I go any further. This isn't a story about bravery. It's not about uncovering the truth. It's about a series of professional decisions that felt reasonable in the moment and catastrophic in hindsight. It's about the danger of assuming intelligence looks like us, thinks like us, or communicates on our terms. And it's about a body on a stainless steel table that everyone insisted was dead, even as it was quietly proving otherwise. The night the footage was uploaded, my phone rang twice. No one spoke. They didn't need to. I recognized the silence. You don't forget it once you've heard it enough times. It's the sound of someone confirming you're still where they expect you to be. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my kitchen until sunrise, staring at the same scar on my left hand I got the night of the autopsy, replaying details I've spent years training myself not to think about. The smell of antiseptic mixed with wet fur. The way the overhead lights reflected differently off its eyes depending on the angle. The sound, not breathing exactly, but something close enough that we told ourselves it didn't count. Back in 1996, I was 43 years old, recently divorced, and grateful for the kind of work that didn't follow me home. I was contracted to a biosecurity research facility in the Northern Rockies, officially tasked with studying zoonotic disease risks in large mammals. Bears. Wolves. Elk. That was the cover. It was convincing enough that I never questioned it too deeply. Questioning things is dangerous when your paycheck depends on not asking why a building has 3 underground levels and armed guards who don't wear unit patches. The facility wasn't secret in the dramatic sense. It had a sign. It had paperwork. It had a budget line buried so deep in federal spending reports that no one ever noticed it. The secrecy wasn't about hiding the building. It was about hiding the purpose. Most of what we examined there was disappointingly normal. Sick animals. Mutations. Injuries exaggerated by poor eyewitness accounts. People see what they expect to see in the dark. I said that more times than I can count. It made me feel rational. It made me feel safe. Then, one evening in late October, I was pulled from my office without explanation and told to report immediately to Examination Room C. No briefing. No prep time. Just urgency. That should have been my first warning. When I arrived, the body was already on the table. Covered. Restrained. Tagged. Declared deceased in transit after prolonged sedation. I remember reading those words on the clipboard and feeling an unexpected sense of relief. Dead things are predictable. Dead things don't surprise you. The man standing on the other side of the table didn't look relieved. Dr. Evan Rowe was younger than me by nearly a decade. Brilliant. Idealistic. The kind of doctor who still believed documentation could change outcomes. He was the one who eventually leaked the footage. At the time, I just noticed his hands wouldn't stop moving. Adjusting gloves. Rechecking instruments. Avoiding the covered shape between us. He didn't say much. Just nodded when I asked if the paperwork was in order. When I asked if this was another bare misidentification, he hesitated for half a second too long before answering. Something like that, he said. We removed the covering together. I've performed thousands of autopsies. Human. Animal. Things that blur the line enough that you stop categorizing them. None of that prepared me for the way my brain rejected what it was seeing while my eyes continued to relay the information anyway. It was large. Larger than any wolf I'd ever examined. Longer limbs. A torso structured for upright posture, though it lay supine. Dense, dark fur broken in places by old scars, not random, not from prey, but from something that fought back with intention. The head was wrong. That's the only word that fits. Canine, but elevated. The jawline supported musculature built for force, not just bite. And the eyes, closed, thankfully, sat forward enough to suggest depth perception optimized for targeting, not chasing. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it looked unfinished. Like evolution had overshot its mark and never bothered to correct it. This isn't in rigor, Evan said quietly. I checked myself. He was right. The limbs resisted movement, but not in the way they should have. The stiffness was inconsistent. Pockets of flexibility where there shouldn't be any. Residual neuromuscular activity, I said automatically. A phrase I'd used before. A phrase that had always worked before. Evan didn't argue. He just looked at the monitor we'd hooked up as a formality. Standard practice. Liability coverage. Nothing more. The line was flat. That should have been the end of my concern. Instead, I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with professional curiosity. A sense that we were late to something already in progress. That whatever this was, it hadn't arrived the moment we uncovered it. It had arrived earlier. And it was waiting. I didn't know then that this would be the last normal thought I'd have for a very long time. I didn't know that by morning, one of us would be dead, the footage would be scheduled to leak, and the word werewolf would start appearing in internal emails marked Do Not Archive. All I knew, standing there under those lights, was that calling it an animal felt dishonest. And calling it dead felt premature. We were told to move quickly. That instruction didn't come from the clipboard or the protocols posted on the wall. It came from the way the room felt once the covering was off. Examination Room C was designed for efficiency, stainless steel surfaces, floor drains, sealed lighting panels. But that night it felt cramped, like the walls had edged closer while we weren't looking. The air smelled faintly metallic beneath the antiseptic, and there was an undercurrent of something else I couldn't place at first. Damp. Organic. Like wet leaves left too long in a closed space. Evan broke the silence by reading aloud from the intake report. Location, Northern Range, approximately 40 miles from the nearest paved road. Recovery conducted by a joint task unit responding to a seismic anomaly flagged by remote sensors. Subject subdued after prolonged engagement. Cause of death listed as cardiopulmonary failure following extreme sedation. Extreme was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The dosage logs attached to the report were absurd, enough to kill several large mammals outright. Enough to stop a heart, to quiet a nervous system permanently. If the paperwork was accurate, the thing on the table should have been cold, stiff, unmistakably dead. It wasn't. As we began the preliminary examination, I kept catching myself glancing at the hands. They were bound loosely with reinforced restraints, more out of habit than necessity. 5 fingers on each hand. The thumbs were opposable, set at an angle that allowed for precision grip. The pads were thick, ridged, scarred in a way that suggested repeated friction against hard surfaces. Not claws scraping bark. Not paws digging soil. Something more deliberate. Tool use, Evan said before I could stop myself from thinking it. I looked at him sharply. He shrugged, as if embarrassed by the conclusion. Or climbing. Or something we haven't catalogued yet. We didn't write it down. Not yet. Early impressions have a way of being used against you later, especially when they veer too far from what's acceptable. We stuck to measurements. Height. Limb ratios. Bone density estimates based on palpation. Every number nudged us further from familiar territory. The legs were built for more than one mode of movement. The joints allowed for upright posture, but the muscle attachment points told a different story. Power distributed in a way that favored sudden acceleration, balance, and endurance. The feet were elongated, the toes longer than a human's, ending in blunt claws worn smooth at the tips. Not from constant use as weapons. From contact with stone. That was when the rationalizations began. Maybe it was a rare hybrid. Maybe an undocumented offshoot. Maybe a bear suffering from a congenital disorder that altered its skeletal development. I'd seen stranger things explained away by genetics and environment. The human brain is very good at building fences around the unknown, labeling it until it stops feeling dangerous. We moved to the head last. I don't know why. Some instinct, maybe, to delay the part we were both avoiding. The skull was heavier than it looked, dense enough that lifting it required more effort than expected. The snout was elongated, but the cranial vault behind it was expanded, accommodating a brain larger than any canine's. The ears, triangular, mobile, were set high and slightly back, positioned for directional hearing. Predator design, refined. The eyes were still closed. I was grateful for that. Even then, there was a sense that opening them would change the room in a way we couldn't undo. Let's get baseline vitals logged, I said, more to anchor myself than for procedural necessity. We attached monitors we both knew would confirm what the paperwork already claimed. Heart rate. Temperature. Electrical activity. The screen flickered to life, lines drawing themselves across black space. The heart monitor showed nothing. A flat line, clean and unambiguous. Temperature, though, gave me pause. 95.8, Evan read aloud. Core. That's not right, I said before I could soften it. He checked the probe placement. Recalibrated. Ran it again. 95.6. Barely a drop. Environmental factors, I said. Insulation. Fur density. Evan nodded, but his mouth tightened. It's been over 12 hours since recovery. I know. We wrote it down anyway, flagged for follow-up. Science thrives on anomalies, but only if you pretend they're temporary. As the night wore on, the facility grew quieter. The usual background hum of activity faded until it felt like we were the only two people left underground. At one point, a security officer passed by the observation window, glanced in, and moved on without stopping. No curiosity. No questions. Just routine. That should have reassured me. Instead, it felt like abandonment. We documented scars across the torso and limbs. Old ones, healed cleanly. Patterns emerged if you looked too long, parallel marks that suggested weapons, not teeth. Blunt force trauma repaired over time. This wasn't a solitary animal. This was something that lived among others, something that survived conflict. Social structure, Evan murmured. Don't, I said, sharper than intended. He raised his hands in mock surrender. I'm just thinking out loud. So am I replied. And I don't like where it's going. Around midnight, we took a brief break. Coffee from a vending machine that tasted faintly of plastic. We stood on opposite sides of the room, backs turned to the table, as if giving it privacy. I remember thinking how absurd that was, the idea that a dead thing could be owed anything. That was when I noticed the sound. At first, I thought it was the ventilation system, air moving through ducts, shifting as pressure equalized. But there was a rhythm to it. Too slow for machinery. Too irregular to be mechanical. A faint, almost inaudible vibration that I felt more than heard, like a low hum just below the threshold of perception. Do you hear that? Evan asked. I nodded. Building noise. He didn't look convinced. Neither was I. We returned to the table and resumed work, focusing on the hands again. The nails were thick, keratin laid densely, edges worn smooth. The skin beneath was calloused in specific places, the base of the thumb, the pads of the fingers. Repetitive stress patterns. Habitual movements. I found myself wondering what it had held. What it had built, or broken, or carried. That was the moment I realized I'd stopped thinking of it as a specimen. The word felt inadequate, like calling a storm a weather event after it's torn your house apart. By 2 in the morning, fatigue had set in. Wood agreed to postpone the internal examination until after a few hours of rest. There was no urgency, we told ourselves. It was dead. It wasn't going anywhere. Better to proceed with clear minds. Before we powered down the monitors, Evan hesitated. His hand hovered over the controls. Let's leave them on, he said. Just in case. Protocol doesn't require. I know, he interrupted gently. But it doesn't forbid it either. I considered arguing. I didn't. Maybe because some part of me wanted an excuse to keep watching, to confirm that the unease crawling under my skin was just nerves. We dimmed the lights, leaving the room bathed in a muted glow, and stepped out into the corridor. As the door sealed behind us, I glanced back through the observation window one last time. The creature lay exactly as we'd left it. Still. Bound. Eyes closed. The monitors glowed softly at its side, lying steady, unbroken. Nothing about it suggested urgency. Nothing about it suggested danger. And yet, as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just turned our backs on something that understood exactly what we were doing, and was patiently deciding how to respond. We slept in shifts, though calling it sleep feels generous. The facility's rest quarters were built for efficiency, not comfort. Narrow bunks, recycled air, lights that never fully dimmed. I closed my eyes and replayed measurements in my head, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself you're still working. Evan didn't even pretend. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling, hands folded on his chest like he was practicing for something. I dreamed anyway. Short, disjointed fragments. The sound from the ventilation system slowing until it matched a pulse. Fingers tapping against glass in a pattern I almost recognized. When I woke, my heart was racing, and for a few seconds I couldn't remember where I was. Then the smell came back to me, antiseptic and damp fur, and I knew. We reconvened in examination room C just after 6. The night crew had logged nothing unusual. No alarms. No changes. That should have settled my nerves. It didn't. The creature was exactly as we'd left it. The restraints were intact. The monitors still glowed softly. Evan checked the temperature first. 95.4. A marginal drop, but not enough to explain the time that had passed. Thermal inertia, I said, because saying something felt better than saying nothing. Of what? Evan asked. I didn't answer. We began the internal examination with practiced efficiency. Incisions clean and deliberate. I narrated findings into the recorder, my voice steady, professional. Muscle density far exceeded expectations. The fibers were tightly packed, layered in a way that suggested sustained power output rather than explosive bursts. This wasn't a sprinter's build. It was endurance refined. When we opened the chest cavity, both of us froze. The organs were wrong. Not malformed. Not damaged. Wrong in the sense that they looked alive. Pink. Resilient. Responsive to touch in a way that made my stomach tighten. There was no sign of the dull grain you expect hours after death. No odor of decay. No slackness. That's not possible, Evan whispered. Delayed autolysis, I said, though the words tasted thin. Unusual metabolism. I could hear myself slipping into the language of excuses, and I hated it. Hated how easy it was. The heart was massive, proportionally larger than a human's, with walls thick enough to generate tremendous force. The structure suggested redundancy, backup pathways, reinforced valves. A design built to keep functioning under extreme stress. As Evan examined it more closely, blood welled up around his incision. Dark, fluid, moving. Not pooled. Not stagnant. I swallowed hard. Check coagulation. He did. The sample flowed smoothly into the collection tube. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The room felt smaller again, the air heavier. I became acutely aware of every sound, the hum of equipment, the faint hiss of ventilation, that low vibration I dismissed the night before. It was still there, steady, almost comforting in its consistency. Maybe it died very recently, Evan said finally. The intake report. Could be wrong. I wanted to argue. Wanted to pull rank, to lean on procedure. Instead, I checked the heart monitor again. The line was flat. That was the thing that kept us grounded. No matter how strange the tissues looked, no matter how many assumptions we had to bend, the monitor told a simple story. No electrical activity. No heartbeat. Dead. We moved on to the abdominal cavity. The digestive system was complex, layered, capable of processing a wide range of organic material. Omnivorous, adaptable. The liver was large and dense, optimized for detoxification. Whatever this thing ate, it could handle poisons that would kill most animals. Survival strategy, Evan murmured. I made a note, though I wasn't sure why. Who was going to read it? The brain was last. Removing the section of skull required more force than expected. The bone resisted the saw, dense enough that we had to recalibrate the equipment twice. When the cranial cavity was exposed, the silence in the room deepened. The brain filled the space completely, its surface folded intricately, maximizing area. The frontal regions were pronounced, structured in a way that suggested planning, decision-making. The temporal areas, associated with processing sound and language in humans, were unusually developed. I leaned closer, my professional detachment slipping despite my best efforts. "This isn't just problem-solving," I said quietly. "This is interpretation." Evan nodded, eyes fixed on the tissue. It could understand patterns. Meaning. The word hung between us, heavy with implication. We worked in near silence after that, each of us lost in our own thoughts. At some point, I realized Evan had set up an additional camera. Not the standard ceiling-mounted recorder, but a small personal device positioned discreetly on a shelf. I didn't call him out on it right away. Part of me wanted plausible deniability. Part of me understood. "Insurance," he said when he noticed me looking. "In case this disappears." "Everything here disappears eventually," I replied. "That's exactly the problem." I should have reported it. I knew that even then. But I didn't. Because I'd spent years watching extraordinary findings get buried under classification labels and budget constraints. Because some part of me was tired of pretending that ignorance was neutrality. Around midday, something happened that still haunts me. As Evan adjusted a retractor, the creature's fingers twitched. It was subtle. Easy to miss. A slight flex, barely perceptible. He froze, eyes wide. "Did you see that?" he asked. "Post-mortem reflex," I said automatically. "Residual nerve firing." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Neither of us mentioned it again. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. We documented, sampled, recorded. Each anomaly was logged, flagged, compartmentalized. We were building a picture of a physiology that shouldn't exist, and pretending that was all it was. By evening, exhaustion weighed on us both. The room felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Evan checked the heart monitor again, more out of habit than concern. The line flickered. Just for a second. A tiny deviation from flat, then back again. "Artifact," I said quickly. "Electrical interference." Evan stared at the screen, then at the creature. "Maybe." We powered down some equipment, but left the monitors running. Again, it wasn't protocol. Again, I didn't stop him. When we finally stepped out of the room, I hesitated. There was a sense, irrational, I told myself, that we were leaving something unfinished. Not the autopsy. Something else. A conversation, perhaps. An obligation. As the doors sealed behind us, the low vibration from the ventilation system seemed to change pitch, deepening, slowing. I paused, hand on the wall, feeling it resonate faintly under my palm. "It's just the building," I muttered. Evan didn't respond. Neither of us looked back. Later, lying awake in that narrow bunk, I realized what we'd been doing all day. We weren't studying a corpse. We were trespassing on something that hadn't decided whether it was done with us yet. And that, more than any data point, should have sent us running. The first thing I noticed when I woke was the silence. Not the absence of sound. Facilities like that are never truly quiet, but the absence of variation. No distant doors opening. No footsteps in the corridor. No muffled voices bleeding through concrete. Just the steady, unchanging hum of systems running on autopilot. It felt like the building was holding its breath. I checked my watch. 5:12 a.m. Evan's bunk was empty. That shouldn't have alarmed me. He was an early riser, always had been. But as I pulled on my coat and stepped into the corridor, a thin line of unease stretched tight in my chest. The lights were dimmed to night cycle levels, casting everything in a flat, gray tone that erased depth and made distances hard to judge. Examination room C was lit. The door was sealed, but I could see movement through the observation window. Evan stood inside, his back to the glass, shoulders hunched, focused on the monitors. The room looked different in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Not rearranged. Not damaged. Just altered. Like the air itself had shifted. I keyed in and stepped inside. "You've been up a while," I said, aiming for casual. He startled, then let out a breath. "Couldn't sleep." Neither could I, but I didn't say that. I moved to the table, my eyes drawn immediately to the chest cavity. It had been partially closed, sutures neat and precise. I didn't remember us doing that. "You finish up?" I asked. Just enough, he said. I wanted to see something. He gestured to the monitors. The heart line was no longer perfectly flat. It wasn't beating. Not in any way you'd chart or call activity. But there was movement. Tiny, rhythmic deflections at regular intervals. So small they could be dismissed as noise. So consistent they couldn't be. That's interference, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Grounding issue. These rooms are notorious for. It's 8 seconds apart, Evan interrupted. Every time. Exactly. I stared at the screen. 8 seconds passed. Another flicker. Identical in amplitude and duration. You've been watching this how long? I asked. Since about 3, he said. It's been getting stronger. I checked the leads myself. Reseated them. Ran diagnostics. Everything came back normal. The equipment insisted there was nothing wrong. The equipment was lying. I placed my hand against the creature's chest without thinking. The skin was cool, but not cold. Beneath it, there was resistance. Tone. As if the muscle remembered what it was supposed to do, even if it hadn't been asked to yet. Alan, Evan said quietly. What if it never actually died? The question hung there, heavy and dangerous. If he was right, everything would done crossed from questionable to unforgivable. That dosage, I began. Would kill anything we know, he finished. But we don't know this. I pulled my hand back, suddenly aware of how close I was. If there's any chance, it's alive, we report it. Immediately. He nodded. I know. But he didn't move toward the intercom. Instead, he adjusted the small camera he'd set up the day before, angling it more directly at the table. The red recording light blinked steadily. What are you doing? I asked. Documenting, he said. In case they decide to shut this down. You're talking about a containment breach, I snapped. This isn't about data preservation. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something there that unsettled me more than the monitor ever could. Not fear. Not excitement. Resolve. They won't study it, he said. They'll terminate it. Or worse, bury it. And this, he gestured at the screen, at the body, at the impossible biology laid out before us, this deserves to be understood. I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it. Because part of me agreed. Because part of me had been complicit in burying things like this for years. Before I could respond, the vibration I'd felt the night before intensified. The low hum deepened, resonating through the table, through the floor, through my bones. The monitors flickered, not erratically, but in sequence. 8 seconds. 7. 6. The intervals were shortening. Evan stepped back, eyes wide. It's cycling up, he whispered. Or the equipment is failing, I said, louder than necessary. This room has backup generators. The creature's chest rose. Just a fraction. Barely perceptible. But undeniable. Time stretched thin, every second dragging like it had weight. The heart monitor jumped again, this time higher, the line twitching in a way that made my own pulse race. It's alive, Evan said. No, I replied, though the word felt meaningless. It can't be. The eyelids fluttered. I've seen people wake up from anesthesia. I know the signs, the confusion, the gradual return of awareness. This wasn't that. The eyes opened slowly, deliberately, revealing a vivid amber that caught the light and reflected it back with unsettling clarity. They focused immediately. On Evan. The room felt suddenly too small to contain what was happening. The air pressed in, thick and charged. The creature's gaze held intelligence so raw and present that it stripped away every comforting lie I'd told myself. This wasn't an animal reacting to stimuli. This was someone assessing a situation. Don't move, I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. Evan took an involuntary step back, bumping into a tray. Instruments rattled, the sound sharp in the tense silence. The creature's nostrils flared. Its head tilted slightly, a gesture so human it made my skin crawl. It looked down at its chest, at the sutures, at the neat line of stitches that traced our intrusion. One clawed finger lifted, touching the thread, following it with almost gentle precision. Something passed across its face. Not confusion. Recognition. And then, anger. Not wild. Not explosive. Controlled. Focused. The kind of anger that comes from understanding exactly what's been done to you. Evan reached for the emergency alert. The creature moved. I don't know how else to describe it. One moment it was on the table, restrained, wounded. The next, it was upright, the restraint snapping like paper. There was no build-up, no warning. Just a blur of motion that ended with it standing between Evan and the door. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it was protecting the exit. "Please," Evan said, his voice shaking. "I was trying to help you." The creature watched him, head tilted, eyes bright. For a heartbeat, maybe longer, it didn't act. It seemed to be listening. Then it looked at the camera. Directly into the lens. And in that moment, I understood something too late. This wasn't about escape. It was about containment. Whatever happened next would not be a reaction. It would be a decision. And I was standing in the room where that decision was about to be carried out. I don't remember leaving the room. I remember sound, metal screaming as something tore free, instruments clattering across tile, the sharp crack of reinforced restraints snapping under force they were never designed to withstand. I remember the air being shoved out of my lungs as I hit the floor, my shoulder slamming hard enough to leave me gasping. And I remember Evan shouting my name once, just once, before everything dissolved into motion and noise. When I came to, I was lying against the corridor wall outside examination room C, the door sealed shut. Alarms were blaring now. Not the gentle alerts we'd heard before, but the kind meant to empty buildings and lock down sections automatically. Red lights strobed along the ceiling. Somewhere deeper in the facility, heavy doors slammed into place one after another, a cascading thud that echoed like distant artillery. I pushed myself upright, pain flaring through my arm and ribs. For a few seconds I just sat there, stunned, trying to piece together how I'd gotten out. The last clear image I had was the creature standing upright, blocking the door, its attention split between Evan and the camera. "Evan." I staggered to my feet and pounded on the sealed door. "Evan." My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the alarms. There was no response. The intercom crackled to life overhead. "All personnel remain where you are. Security teams are en route. This is not a drill." I backed away from the door, my mind racing. If the creature was loose inside the facility, staying put was a terrible idea. If it wasn't, going back in was worse. I didn't have long to decide. The alarms cut abruptly. The sudden silence was almost worse. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then I heard footsteps, many of them, running, boots pounding concrete. Armed security flooded the corridor, weapons raised, faces tense. Someone grabbed me, shoved me against the wall, demanded answers I couldn't give fast enough. I kept trying to look past them, toward the door, but they blocked my view. "Where is it?" someone shouted. "I don't know," I said, and hated how true that was. They breached the room without waiting for clearance. The door hissed open, and for a moment I saw only chaos, overturned tables, scattered instruments, blood smeared in broad arcs across steel and tile. The creature was gone. Evan was still there. He was sitting against the far wall, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around himself. His eyes were open, but unfocused, staring at something only he could see. Blood soaked the front of his coat, but it wasn't all his. When I tried to reach him, a medic held me back. "He's alive," the medic said, surprised. "Shock. Severe." They moved Evan onto a stretcher, his body limp, unresponsive. He didn't speak. He didn't look at me. Whatever had happened in that room, whatever exchange had passed between him and the creature, it had hollowed him out completely. The official story formed quickly. Containment failure. Aggressive specimen. Emergency response. I was escorted to an interview room and questioned for hours by people who didn't introduce themselves and didn't write anything down. Every answer I gave was weighed, dissected, filed away somewhere I would never see. By the time they released me, the facility was locked down tighter than I'd ever seen it. Military vehicles lined the perimeter. Helicopters thudded overhead, sweeping the surrounding wilderness with searchlights and sensors. The creature had vanished into terrain that swallowed heat signatures and erased tracks as if it knew exactly how humans hunted. They never found it. Evan was transferred to a medical wing under guard. I was told he'd suffered a psychological break triggered by trauma. That he'd likely never return to work. That I was not to attempt contact. 2 days later, I was sent home on indefinite leave. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The leak happened a week later. It began as a link passed quietly through obscure forums, then spread faster than anyone expected. Grainy footage. Awkward angles. No context. Just enough clarity to spark arguments and fear. People called it fake, a hoax, a viral stunt. Others slowed it down frame by frame, pointing out details that didn't fit any known animal. The footage wasn't from the ceiling camera. It was Evan's. I recognized the angle immediately. The perspective from the shelf, slightly off-center, capturing more of the room than official recordings ever allowed. My stomach dropped as I watched, knowing exactly how this had happened. He'd set an automated upload. I watched the footage alone in my kitchen, curtains drawn, volume low. My hands shook so badly I had to pause it twice just to steady myself. The video showed things I hadn't seen in person. Details I'd missed in the chaos. The way the creature's attention sharpened when Evan spoke about sharing the footage. About the outside world. About people seeing it. That was the moment everything changed. Up until then, the creature's movements had been cautious, reactive. After that, its posture shifted. The head tilt deepened. The eyes narrowed, not in aggression, but in calculation. It wasn't responding to the autopsy. It was responding to the idea of exposure. When it vocalized, the sound sent chills down my spine even through cheap speakers. Not a howl. Not a roar. Structured, rhythmic sounds that carried intent. The camera shook slightly, as if even the equipment sensed something fundamental had shifted. The creature moved then, not toward the door, not toward Evan, but toward the equipment. It ripped cables free, crushed monitors, tore into the server rack along the wall with deliberate precision. It wasn't lashing out. It was dismantling. Containment. Only after that did it turn back to Evan. The footage cut out before the worst of it. The last clear image was the creature standing over him, head bowed slightly, eyes bright with something that looked uncomfortably like judgment. I sat there long after the video ended, the final frame burned into my vision. Evan hadn't been punished for leaking the footage. He'd been neutralized. Removed as a variable. Within hours of the leak gaining traction, it vanished. Accounts were deleted. Links broke. Search results scrubbed clean. The government moved with a speed and coordination that bordered on impressive. Too late. Copies existed now. Fragments. Enough to keep the conversation alive, even as the original was erased. I was called in one last time. A short meeting. Polite. Final. I was reminded of my obligations, my agreements. I was advised, kindly, to forget what I thought I'd seen. Evan never recovered. He was transferred to a long-term care facility under a different name. I visited once, standing at the end of his bed while he stared at the wall, unblinking. He didn't recognize me. I don't know if he recognized anyone. As I left, I noticed a faint pattern scratched into the plastic bedrail. Shallow lines, repeated, almost geometric. The same pattern I'd seen briefly on the footage, carved into steel by claws that understood symmetry. That was when it finally sank in. The leak hadn't been a mistake. It had been a signal. And whatever was out there now knew exactly how dangerous we could be, if we were allowed to keep talking. I left the facility for the last time on a gray morning that felt intentionally unremarkable. No escort. No final briefing. Just a signature on a form that confirmed I no longer had a need to know. They let me keep my ID badge as a courtesy, a meaningless piece of plastic that stopped opening doors the moment I crossed the perimeter. I didn't argue. I didn't look back. I told myself that distance would quiet the memories. That time would sand down the sharp edges until what remained felt theoretical, like a case study you could analyze without flinching. That's what I told myself when I took a position as a medical examiner in a coastal town far enough from the mountains to feel safe. Normal work. Normal deaths. Normal explanations. For a while, it worked. Then, 6 months later, I went camping. I don't have a good explanation for why. I wasn't an outdoorsman before the facility, and I certainly wasn't one after. But something in me needed trees and silence and distance from screens. I chose a national forest several hours from where I lived, a place with limited cell service and well-marked trails. I told myself it was harmless. Controlled. The first night was uneventful. The second, less so. I woke just after midnight to the sense of being observed. Not fear exactly, more like awareness, the way you know someone has entered a room even before you hear them. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to outline the trees beyond my tent. There was movement out there. Slow. Deliberate. Heavy footsteps circling the perimeter of my campsite, careful not to snap branches or disturb the undergrowth more than necessary. Bipedal. The cadence was wrong for a human, the stride too long, the pauses too measured. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The circuit took time. One full rotation. Then another. By the third, my legs were numb and my jaw ached from clenching it. I expected it to end the way all my nightmares did, with fabric tearing, claws, pain. Instead, the footsteps stopped. Something heavy was placed on the ground just outside the ring of light. A soft thud. Then retreat. The sounds faded into the forest, swallowed by distance and terrain. I waited until dawn. When I finally stepped out of the tent, the air was cold and clean, birdsong returning cautiously. The fire pit was undisturbed. No tracks led toward the trees. No broken branches. If not for what lay behind my tent, I might have convinced myself it hadn't happened. A deer skull sat upright on the ground, bleached white by time. The eye sockets faced my tent. Around it, arranged with careful symmetry, were 7 stones, each roughly the same size. Not placed randomly. Positioned. The same pattern. I sank down onto the dirt and stared at it until my eyes burned. There was no blood. No threat in the traditional sense. Just a message, delivered with restraint. I understood it immediately. I know who you are. I know what you did. You walked away. 7 stones. 7 people who had been present during the initial examination. 7 signatures on the intake report. 7 lives it had spared. I packed up within the hour and left without finishing my coffee. I didn't take the skull. I didn't disturb the stones. Some messages aren't meant to be answered. After that, I stopped pretending the creature was gone. It didn't need to haunt me directly. It lived in the margins, news articles about equipment failures in remote areas, reports of hikers finding geometric arrangements of stones and wood with no explanation, entire stretches of forest going unnaturally quiet for days at a time. Not attacks. Warnings. Boundaries reinforced. I saw the pattern elsewhere too. Research initiatives quietly defunded. Surveillance projects shelved without explanation. Whistleblowers discredited before they could gain traction. The world didn't change overnight, but it adjusted. Like a system compensating for an external pressure it didn't fully understand. I began to suspect the creature wasn't alone. Not in the sense of numbers, necessarily, but in purpose. A species, or something like it, that had survived by observing us the way we observe ecosystems. Identifying keystone behaviors. Intervening only when necessary. Remaining invisible not out of fear, but out of strategy. That realization unsettled me more than any monster story ever could. Because it meant we weren't the apex presence we believed ourselves to be. We were a variable. Potentially dangerous. In need of monitoring. I'm telling this story now because I'm old, and the people who made me afraid are either retired or dead. Because the footage resurfaced and reminded me how close we came to forcing a confrontation we wouldn't survive. And because silence, in this case, feels like a betrayal, not of humanity, but of restraint. I'm not releasing the footage. Not now. Not ever. The world doesn't need a clearer image. It needs understanding. Curiosity without humility is a weapon, and we've already demonstrated how recklessly we wield it. If you've listened this far, consider this a warning, not an invitation. These beings exist at the edges of our maps and our assumptions. They are intelligent. They are deliberate. And they have shown a capacity for mercy that we rarely extend in return. The next time you're in the wilderness and you feel something moving parallel to you, something too large and too careful to be coincidence, don't panic. Don't chase it. Don't film it. Leave. You are not being hunted. You are being assessed. I honored the boundary I was given. I stayed away. I kept my mouth shut where it mattered. This, what you're hearing now, is the compromise I can live with. Words without coordinates. Truth without a trail. If the creature, or whatever term you're more comfortable with, can understand this, then understand something in return. I'm sorry. For the table. For the cuts. For the assumption that being studied was somehow a favor. And thank you. For the stones. For the choice to warn instead of erase. The wild places are shrinking. Our reach is expanding. One day, those lines may cross again. When they do, I hope we remember this lesson. Not everything unknown needs to be illuminated. Some things survive because they stay just out of sight, watching, deciding whether we're a threat, or just passing through.